The move the pawn to c4 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to e4, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to c5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to f3 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to e6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to d4 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the pawn on the c-file takes on d4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. The move the pawn to c5 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to e5, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to g3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to f6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the bishop to g2 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to d5 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the pawn on the c-file takes on d5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Knight 2, a solid developing move, maintaining flexibility and preparing kingside castling. Black develops their knight, contesting the center and preparing their own development. The move the pawn to g3 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the knight to c3, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost, paving the way for the knight to c6, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to d4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the pawn on the c-file takes on d4, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the knight takes on d4 executes a favorable trade. This allows the pawn to e6, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the pawn to g6 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to d5, claiming key space in the center. Afterwards, the pawn on the c-file takes on d5 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the knight takes on d5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the bishop to g2 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the knight to c6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the knight to c3, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the pawn to b3 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the bishop to g2, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space, paving the way for the bishop to g7, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to c3 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to d5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to d4 with highly aggressive threats. This allows short castles, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black develops the queen's bishop to, completing their fianchetto setup. White develops the bishop to, aiming at the long diagonal and supporting the center. Black develops the queen's bishop to, supporting their control of central squares. White develops the king's bishop to, completing the fianchetto and preparing castling. Black develops the queen's bishop to, reinforcing their diagonal influence. White castles kingside, securing the king and preparing to connect the rooks. Black castles kingside, mirroring white's king's safety. The move the knight to c3 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to d4, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to d5, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the pawn on the d-file takes on c5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the pawn on the d-file takes on c4, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the pawn on the c-file takes on b6, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the pawn on the f-file takes on b6, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Black strikes in the center with, challenging white's central presence. White captures the central pawn, simplifying the position slightly. Black recaptures, maintaining central pawn presence. White exchanges the fianchettoed bishop for black's knight, a solid positional trade. Black recaptures with the king, centralizing it slightly but altering pawn structure. White recaptures on, opening a file and reinforcing central control. Black recaptures with the queen, centralizing it and increasing attacking potential. White advances the d-pawn, establishing a strong central pawn presence. Black challenges the center again, creating dynamic pawn play. White captures, forking the queen and a pawn, a strong tactical sequence. Black recaptures, maintaining material equality. White recaptures with the knight, repositioning it to a more active central square. Black exchanges their fianchettoed bishop for white's knight, simplifying the game. White recaptures with the king, bringing it towards the center after castling. Black activates their rook on the c-file, aiming for open files. White centralizes their rook on the c-file, contesting black's control. Black repositions their knight, improving its central influence. White centralizes their other rook, preparing to contest the d-file. Black maneuvers their knight to a strong central outpost. White advances the b-pawn, potentially creating a flank majority. Black repositions the knight, creating attacking potential on the queenside. White advances their knight to a dynamic positional move. Black exchanges rooks, simplifying the position towards an endgame. White recaptures with the rook, maintaining active rook play. Black pushes the a-pawn, creating a passed pawn threat on the queenside. White advances the a-pawn, a solid move in response to black's pawn push. Black repositions the rook, supporting the d-pawn and preparing to contest the file. White maneuvers the rook to, targeting black's pawn structure. Black repositions the rook, activating it on the d-file. White maneuvers the knight to, preparing for further queenside action. Black captures the pawn on the a-file, opening the position. White recaptures, opening lines and centralizing their king. The move the pawn to e6 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook to d4, activating the rook on an open file. Afterwards, the rook takes on e7, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the rook takes on b4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Whereby the knight to c6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the rook to b2 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the knight to d8, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the knight to c6 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to h4, claiming key space in the center. Paving the way for the rook to d2, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the king to f3 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. Whereby the pawn to h6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the knight to c8 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to g5, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the rook to d2 by black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the knight to b2, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost. Paving the way for the pawn to e3, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the king to f8 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. whereby the pawn to f4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, allowing the rook to d2 with check, forcing the enemy king to find safety. This allows the king to f3, guaranteeing long-term space control. White repositions the knight to, exploiting black's blunder and consolidating a winning advantage. Black captures the rook, a forced exchange in a losing position. White captures the f-pawn with the knight, a strong tactical blow. Black advances the h-pawn, attempting to create counterplay. White checks with the knight, forcing black's king into a dangerous position. The move the king to f6 by black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the king to f8, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to h4, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to e5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This is reinforced by the knight to h7 with check, gaining a vital tempo with check, unlocking the king to g8 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the king to f3, guaranteeing long-term space control. White repositions the king to, consolidating the winning advantage. The move the rook takes on f2 with check by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook to e5, activating the rook on an open file, allowing the rook to f7 with check, forcing the enemy king to find safety. Continuing with the king takes on g5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This is reinforced by the pawn to f4 with check, gaining a vital tempo with check, unlocking the king to g4 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the pawn on the f-file takes on e5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White recaptures with the king, maintaining overwhelming material superiority. Black recaptures the knight, simplifying further but remaining in a lost position. White centralizes the king, activating it in the endgame. Black moves the king, trying to escape the danger zone. White advances the b-pawn, creating a dangerous passed pawn. Black moves the king, seeking safety but in a lost cause. White maneuvers the rook to, a decisive positional advantage. The move the knight to b2 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the knight to c5, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost. Afterwards, the rook takes on c5, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the pawn on the b-file takes on c5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the pawn to b6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to c4 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to b7, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the rook to c2 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook to h4 with check, delivering a check that forces defensive coordination, paving the way for the king to g2, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the king to e2 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to g5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the rook takes on h5, executes a favorable trade. This allows the pawn to g4, guaranteeing long-term space control.